Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Avrisano. Today's guest is Beth Rooney, Port Director at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Beth oversees the largest U.S. East Coast container port, and that's right here in my backyard, basically. The Port of New York and New Jersey offers numerous options to move cargo, providing unmatched access to one of the largest and most concentrated consumer markets in the world, as well as fast access to key inland and northern markets here in the U.S. Beth, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Looking forward to this discussion.
I am totally excited. We talk a lot about, ship owners and charterers and other people within the line, and the ports are such a key part about it. So I'm excited to chat with you about that today. So talk to us a little bit about what's going on at the port. I was chatting a little bit beforehand, and it sounded like you were having some exciting times in a good way. Every day's a new day. Everything, something new happens. So what's going on at the port, these days that you want to tell everybody about?
Well, every day really is a new day in the port. Just this morning, we had an incident at one of our terminals, and I'm like, geez, that's the first time in 35 years I've heard of something like that happening. So every day really is, a new day. Business is good. Business is strong. We are, up above our 2019, pre-pandemic numbers. The pandemic gave us a look into the future. We did in 2022 the volume that we didn't forecast doing until 2030. So not very often that you have a view into the future. So right now, Chris, we're working on preparing for the future when it really does come. So, we have a really good sense, because of that unusual volume and growth as to how the new normal is going to be as we reach those volumes again, and we're preparing for that and preparing to handle that in a more efficient, more productive, more reliable way than we did in 2022. So there's a number of infrastructure improvements that are going on, road and rail. And just yesterday, we had a signing ceremony with the Army Corps of Engineers to advance the design of a 55-foot channel into New York Harbor. So lots of, good things going on. Collaboration, I think, in the Port of New York and New Jersey stands alone, I would say, in the port communities around the country in terms of how we collaborate with all of the stakeholders throughout the ecosystem to ensure that it runs efficiently. So every day is a new day, and I love coming in and seeing what's going to hit me today.
Well, that's a lot of enthusiasm, and that's always goes to show having a great job and something that you love, and you've been there for a little while. I think you said in my 35 years I haven't seen something. Talk a little bit about your background, because you've been at the port. You have Beth and I share a common background. We both went to the fine institution of SUNY Maritime. I think you can call it the institution. We could joke around. There's a lot of jokes there, maybe not for this podcast, but talk a little bit about kind of your how you got into it and where you are today.
Going back, after, graduation, I spent a couple of years working for one of the local, vessel steamship agencies and, doing agent, and husbandry work, and worked in a number, based in New Jersey, but, working in ports up and down the East Coast. We were just starting to open an office here in New Jersey. And then I had an opportunity to join the Port Authority and joined in operations. I'm in my 31st year. I've held a number of different jobs that really have touched virtually every aspect of what it means to operate a port, and in our case, be a landlord Port Authority. So I've done operations, I've done property management, leasing, I've done intermodal rail. I stood up the Red Hook barge service and purchased barges and mobile harbor cranes that operate that barge. I did technology, believe it or not, for the purposes of making the port more efficient. I knew nothing about technology. I still know nothing about technology. But what I knew was, how ports operate and how cargo moves. So I could tell the people who were much smarter than me what it is that we needed to do. And then they figured out the technology to make that happen. Then 9/11 happened. And the morning after 9/11, I walked into Port Newark to the administration building. Coast Guard retired Admiral Rick Larrabee, who was the port director at the time, gave me a hug and a kiss. I said, "Thank God you're okay." I said, "No, thank God you're okay." And, he said, "You're in charge of port security." And that totally changed, my trajectory for about 14 years, where I really had the honor of being part of forming what is the international and domestic framework for port and maritime security today. And then the same Admiral Larrabee, had asked me a question when we were going through a period of gross inefficiency and congestion in the Port of New York and New Jersey. He asked me a question on a Friday afternoon. I was like, I don't know, but let me think about it. And I think that's what, Maritime College, gave us, the skill set to do, think on our feet, think out of the box, solve problems, and I tell people, we were trained to be self-sufficient on a ship. You're out in the middle of the ocean, right? And you have you and your shipmates in order to solve a problem. You can't order something on Amazon, in order to fix the leak. And, so
you can't call the fire department.
You can't call the fire
department.
Right, exactly.
And my late father used to say that, he was a volunteer firefighter. He used to get a big kick when I would come home from school, and he'd take me to the firehouse. Talk about the day, he got that was his huge thing. And it was funny, but that's what they said. It was always like, well, these are the tools you have to fix it. Like, firstly, when I was sailing, we were at school, there was no such thing as Amazon. What? Yeah. Saying that there was, you had to be self-sufficient. And I go back to your comment about, the technology. I mean, I'm in technology. I'm a product manager. We have some super smart people. And I'm like you, I don't know code. I kind of get database structure only because I tried to study and learn it just on a very high level. That's it. I go to the smart people and I say, this is what I wanted to do. This is what our clients wanted to do.
Yeah.
Now go do it.
Yeah. And and again, that's how we're built, it's, I'm not an expert in a lot of things, and we have to rely on, those experts around us, to form the team. So,
right.
It's, so when we had this productivity and congestion problem, Rick asked me this question and I'm like, I don't know, but let me think about it over the weekend. And again, I was thinking about, we're out on the ship in the middle of the ocean by ourselves and we have to solve this problem. What are we going to do? And I came back to him on Monday morning with a white paper. And that white paper is what is today, almost 10 years later, the Council on Port Performance. And the Council on Port Performance, as a collaborative group of every stakeholder in that ecosystem, who gets together on a proactive basis to look at the issues, look at the impediments, and work together on how we can make the port more reliable, more efficient, more productive. So I parlayed that, into a new position and then became the assistant director and the deputy director and eventually the port director. So, I've been extremely fortunate to have had the opportunities within the Port Authority that I have. I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would be, a port director, or the director of the Port of New York and New Jersey. Not something that I aspired to do until, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I was like, I can do this. And it's extremely humbling to be in this position and work with such an extraordinary team within the Port Authority and all of our partners and stakeholders. It takes a village to run a port, and we've got something special going on here in New York and New Jersey.
When you think of ports, you think of, sleepy ports. And ever since COVID, right? To an extent, 9/11 as well, especially here in the US, especially on the East Coast. But for the broader maritime community, everybody kind of the outside the maritime community actually became very focused on ports. Talk about infrastructure. You talk about building infrastructure. Is part of that infrastructures that are, in addition to roads and rails, it has to be, and you mentioned your role in the kind of the digitization, it has to be some advancement there as well, because the inefficiencies that the group that you stood up probably identified a lot of digital information inefficiencies that could probably have been and maybe continue to evolving, being solved through digitization.
For sure. And the maritime industry are not quick to innovate. When you think about the whole innovation that started with containerization in 1956, right? That was massive.
Right.
But we've been pretty slow to innovate since then.
And if you think about that concept really has, with 75 years almost, right? That hasn't really, the needle hasn't moved. I mean, there's efficient, and I'm sure I can get somebody talking about box technology and reefer technology. Yes, okay, I'm not saying that, but in general, the idea of putting stuff into a container, locking it, and sending it, hasn't changed.
But now, right, what has changed is it used to be put your box on a ship and it's out of sight, out of mind, and when it arrives, it arrives. And now the customer, is focused on where's my box? When am I going to get it? Is it secure? How is it? When is it going to be available? And because the just-in-time inventory that, we learned about, in school, they are really managing inventories to just in time. And data and digitalization has allowed retailers to have much better predictability in terms of consumer purchasing and what happens with consumers in New York, New Jersey versus in California versus in Iowa. How do we behave compared to folks elsewhere in the country? And we behave different in the summer than we behave, in the winter. So data has been a huge catalyst in, I think, changing the way that shippers and customers and stakeholders of the port want in order, to do their business. We've used within the Port Authority, right? So we're a landlord port authority, unlike the Port of Savannah, another one of our, shipmates, Griff Lynch runs the Port of Savannah. Ed McCarthy, another one of our shipmates, is a deputy down there. They're an operating port authority. So it's Port Authority people, that are doing the work.
They control it. You guys have to more have to push a little bit or coax.
And it does, right? That is a big differentiator for us. And it's not a traditional role of a port authority, of a landlord port authority in particular, to get involved in the ecosystem. Landlord port authorities typically collect their rent, provide the basic infrastructure and, wash, rinse, repeat. But we're really involved, in the meat and potatoes of making the port operate. So when I think about digitalization, there's been a number of things that we've done, in recent years. One having to do with using geographical information systems and, GIS mapping. And now to the point where, every piece of critical infrastructure within our port facilities, our fire hydrants, our light posts, our water valves, and then every lease area, layered onto maps where, we can identify the leasehold, critical areas in the leasehold, fire hazards in the leasehold. When the lease expires, right? So everything is built into different layers of a GIS map in which we can manage the property. And then by mapping the utilities, for example, into those, then we leverage that information into our asset management and how, we've got over 100 guys and gals that are maintenance folks of all sorts of crafts, electricians, structural mechanics, plumbers that are maintaining the port's, infrastructure. And, we now see and visualize, in our geographic information systems, and we tie the work orders and the maintenance that we have to do into that. And we're able to, through our asset management system, another part of our digitalization, effort. We know where every piece of a pump, a valve, a widget, each individually identified with a barcode. And you're able to now drill down into the system to say, okay, this pump has to be maintained. And once every 3 months, you have to, change out
change the packing.
Whatever.
Packing.
Exactly.
I did that a few times.
And then we're able to see, yes, it was done. And Chris did it. And Chris did it on May 30th, 2024. And if Chris doesn't know how to do it, you can drill down into almost like a YouTube video, or the manufacturer's books that, show you how to do it. So this is monumental for Port Authority. And in talking to port authorities around the country, asset management is something that really hasn't been embraced yet. But for us, we've been able to streamline our processes. We've been able to increase our operational efficiency. It's a great decision support tool. There's cost savings that go along with it. So it's been a big move for us. Bringing it back to ship activity, one of the things that we've also been able to do with digitalization is map berth utilization. So how often are our berths being used? And we've got 60 odd berths in our facilities in the Port of New York and New Jersey. So how often are our berths being used, and what kinds of ships, length, beam, draft, are using them? And in those same systems, we can now layer on hydrographic surveys so we can see siltation, and we can see, current draft or water depth, and ships, can use them. So we look to optimize berth utilization, because that's one of the capacity, figures that goes into, how much can your port handle? And then, we use it to manage our maintenance dredging cycles. And, if we know that a particular berth is used by a particular class of ship, and those ships are usually in on Wednesdays and Thursdays, we are able to work with the contractor to say, hey, get in on a Friday, get out by Wednesday, get all that maintenance dredging done, in that time. Yeah. This is all stuff that we've done in the last couple of years, and it's innovative, it's creative. And to me, without being a technology geek, it's like super exciting to me.
Don't have to be a technologist to appreciate technology, I think. One of the things, and you kind of alluded to this before, and I like to get your ideas on this, and you must have had to deal with this challenge, and kind of it's in two parts. One is, even within the port, when you were doing this digitization, especially around the asset management, but of course around, being a landowner and trying to get this data from your leasees, I guess, you must have to dealt a ton with siloing of data. This is my data. And people, they take ownership of this to the point where they don't want to give it up, but we're all trying to be on the same team here. Did you encounter a lot of that? How was it? Was it surprising that easy? Was it surprisingly difficult? Are you still convincing people, whether it's leasees or internally, the guy that's been at the port 10 years longer than you, still calls you the newbie, because every workplace has one of those. Are you still dealing with that?
So interestingly, and that is an issue, but not in the types of systems, that I was talking about, because we own the infrastructure and therefore we have most of that data, anyway. But where that is a problem, Chris, is when it comes to visibility into cargo and cargo visibility and moving the cargo. And our partners, our terminal operators here, have formed an entity called Sustainable Terminal Services, or STS. And STS, as a nonprofit corporation, owns the port community system that is in place in the Port of New York, New Jersey. And the port community system is a one-stop shopping website, but it pulls information from the terminal operators, from the ocean carriers, Customs and Border Protection, and others. And it allows a shipper, a Nike or a Gap of the world, or their trucker, their service provider, to go into a single portal and get information on the status of their container that could be at 6 of our container terminals spread across the region. So that's where you begin to get into challenges, because that's where the information is seen as being confidential, business proprietary. I don't want anybody, see this. This is competitive information. And, I think there's been a benefit from having our terminal operators, manage the system where they're driving it, all. And then, but the federal government is working on this system called FLOW. I don't know that it means anything, FLOW, but they're working on this.
I don't know, freight logistics.
Yeah, probably freight logistics. So they're working on this system called FLOW, and a number of our terminal operators and ocean carriers, participate. And, one of the challenges that we need to deal with as a public entity is data security, and the fact that we are subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. So if we as the Port Authority have access to all this information, it can be queried by the public, and we would have to make it available. So, but the benefit of the federal government doing this is that they're exempt. And so like the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, is exempt from Freedom of Information Act, requests.
That's interesting.
So that information becomes, more protected, right? And then, so those are some of the challenges, that we deal with. The other issue in general with all this digitalization is cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And now you have, operating, OT, operating technologies, information technologies, OT, IT, SCADA systems that are, running critical infrastructure, that are, running ship's engine rooms and running, half the equipment on a bridge. You and I walk on the bridge of a ship today. It's very different from the ships that we sailed on. So,
I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't even imagine thinking about it. I do have a dream once in a while that I'm on a ship and I have no idea what I'm doing. And I wake up usually in a cold sweat.
Well, I often have I do, every new ship that comes in, particularly as they get larger, we have a new class of ship. I have the opportunity to go on board, and I walk onto the bridge and, my mind is blown, by just the numbers of computer screens and monitors and things like that. But there is concern about protecting all of that and ensuring that somebody who is looking to do harm, isn't able to take over a bridge, take over an engine room, take over an industrial control system that, is managing a part of the port complex.
Exactly. And then I think that digitization goes hand in hand with the other D word, and that's decarbonization, which we think of it as the entity of the ship. But you as the port, and again, in your interesting role as a port, as a landowner, but yet you're the high priority that people will look to. They're not going to look to your whoever rents, leases the terminal. They look to you for this. How is that played into the roles of ports within decarbonization, the whole digital part, because you have to be monitoring our ships, burning the right fuel, what are the tugs doing? And then on the positive way, and it was struck me, this was 6 years ago, I attended maybe you were at the conference at SUNY. They had like the Blue Highways conference there.
Oh, yes, I was there.
And
we actually announced the North Atlantic Marine Highway Alliance. We announced at that event.
That was a great event. And what struck me the most was a presenter, I think it was Bob Kunkel, talked about like if you could move one ton of cargo with 1 gallon of fuel goes a certain distance on truck, and then it's almost double by rail, and then it's almost double by ship. So there is a positive story in general, especially in a place like New York, where there is that opportunity to talk about the barge service. That's what I kind of thought of as the implications there. But then also just like what you said, keeping track of the information and who's in and how long. And then there's probably, I bet there's some thought, if not already, how does that become more efficient from a decarbonization point of view? I'm sure that's something you guys are looking at, and then you get into the whole things of green corridors. Talk a little bit about those things.
Yeah. So we could talk about sustainability for hours.
I'm not Joe Rogan. Somebody said, why don't you do like a 3-hour podcast like Joe Rogan? I said, look, if you pay me $3 million or $20 million, I'll do a 3-hour podcast, but that's not what this is.
So sustainability is one of the Port Authority's, key priorities. And in the Port Department of the Port Authority, we've been focused on, decarbonization and criteria air pollutant reductions going back to 2009. And we've made tremendous strides. We've provided incentives to trucking companies and truck drivers to replace their oldest diesel trucks. We give $25,000 grants if they agree to destroy the old truck. We've also been phasing out those dirtiest trucks that serve the port. Again, similar incentives for cargo handling equipment and locomotives. On the vessel side, we provide cash incentives to ocean carriers to both slow down as they, reach the outer continental shelf, essentially, and to burn ultra low sulfur fuel. But this is the one area, with the exception of energy management systems, like in our buildings, where we're able to, control fuel efficiency and, lead, lighting offices and restrooms and kitchens and things like that, which we're able to monitor. The area of decarbonization is still very manual tracking. So we do an emissions inventory every year to calculate the direct and indirect impact of the Port of New York and New Jersey's operations on emissions. And it's spreadsheets, that are then, fat fingered, and calculated, using EPA, standards and things like that. We're not quite at the place where the digitalization has helped us with the sustainability, but I think it will come. So there will come a time that ships are either going to get plugged in, or there's going to be, maybe a portable battery pack that the ship plugs into while they're alongside. And then you'll be able to draw information from that in terms of the clean electricity or the clean hydrogen that was used. So there's lots of things going on in the maritime industry, particularly with ship owners and ship operators on addressing the ships, because the ships themselves are the largest emitter, then onto the truck side. But I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the decarbonization world in the next 2 to 3, maybe 5 years. And then I think there'll be a connection to the digitalization so that we can capture that information about decarbonization.
Yeah, that kind of handshake, because right now it's going to live, the decarbonization and the responsibility is really living with the ship owner, and then to some extent the charterer, depending on how those things go. The port just kind of lives okay, we'll live here. But it's curious to hear that. Something you talk about, coming out of school. Let's rewind. You and I are fresh and new and shiny 30 years ago. What would you tell a 30, 35 years ago person about getting into the maritime space? Maybe they didn't go to a maritime school. Oh, goodness gracious, they didn't. But what would you tell somebody about getting in? Like today, why come work for the Port Authority or a Port Authority or a shipping line where you started, if they had that opportunity?
Yeah. So, I personally think, without even thinking about our maritime background, it's just a really exciting industry. And it's one that most people don't know anything about. They take for granted every single day. But when you get into it, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunities to do different things every couple of years if you want to, and still make a tremendous impact. And as corny as it sounds, what we do day in and day out impacts everybody's lives.
Absolutely.
In ways that they don't appreciate. And for me, I'd say 95% of the port department staff at the Port Authority is not maritime trained and educated, but there is something very contagious about working in this industry. And they're all experts in engineering and finance and property management and business development and what have you. But once they get into the maritime industry, they just get hooked.
They do, yeah.
So it's and that's what I think is great about it. So I guess my message to those who haven't trained and and educated in this is give it a shot. You'll be here for life.
Deal with developers, none of which who had maritime background until they started working of QD now Bethann, and it's just really interesting. And you sit there, you try to educate them, like, oh, okay. And then they start to make like connections with like all of these different things that are happening along the way. And I also, to your point, what I think is great is, like you said, you don't have to have a maritime background. You could be involved. You could be involved in making a port carbon neutral. You could be involved in, like you said, an asset management system that is saving the port X amount of dollars per year and in loss and and other things like that, which is a hugely important thing that just is so critical to the mission. And the final question, I know you're busy, love to ask this. You're a busy person. You're all over the place. You're going to be honored soon by the Seamen's Church. You're honored all over the place. Don't know if you have time to do this. And there are a lot of acceptable answers. And that is what's on your bookshelf. Now, acceptable answers can be, I listen to audiobooks. I listen to podcasts. I'm writing a book. We've had a few people who are like, I'm writing a book. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. One guy, Dr. Viz, who's a bunker expert, is writing a book about why bunker quality has to be better and how if we had the issues that we have in the maritime space with the airline industry in terms of bunker quality, and airplanes had those problems, it'd be a very different story. Very interesting food for thought. But what are you doing in that realm?
This is a tough question because I'll tell you, I don't like to read.
Okay.
And I don't like to read. I'm dyslexic and have a pretty significant reading comprehension problem. So it's always been very difficult for me. And I don't read for pleasure. And if I do read for pleasure, so I'd say what's on my bookshelf is my email. That I spend an extraordinary amount of time on. But I am a fan of short stories. And I think that goes to, really just my, ability to understand them and manage them and synthesize us. I get lost in a book. I don't follow it. So I can't tell you the last time I read a book.
Wow. That's one of the most interesting answers. And thanks for sharing that, because I'm sure a lot of people struggle with that sort of thing. I'm one of the people that you hate because like I could go, oh, and it flows. Yeah. So, but then again, getting the attention span of sitting down. And I also find a lot of people love the audiobooks because they pop it in, they drive to work, and they could just, kind of get lost in that as well. But that's really fascinating.
So I mean, and I never intended to go down this path, but I think this is the message also to people, or their kids, who could be struggling, with learning, differences and what have you. It has zero impact if you work hard on how successful you are, in life. So
absolutely.
If there's one takeaway from your question about, what's on my bookshelf is empty. And I don't read for pleasure, but it doesn't impact, what I've been able to do in life.
No, that's a great message for a lot of people who I'm sure, whether it's them or kids or friends who have, who don't have reading as an outlet because of some of those things, and they have to look at other things or do other things, which, like you said, has zero impact because, some super successful people like yourself show that every day. Beth, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was great. I hope everybody found this enlightening. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks again, Chris. It was fun.
Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of The Last Dinosaur, Maritime Shipping in the Digital Age, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. As a reminder, if you enjoy this episode, please follow the podcast and leave a 5-star review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and improve our content. Don't forget to share the podcast with friends and colleagues who are passionate about the maritime industry. Every share helps us grow our community. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/thelastdinosaur. Your support helps cover the cost of production and keeps the show going strong. Lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode or becoming a partner, please reach out to me directly. Drop me an email at thelastdinosaurpod@gmail.com. I'm always looking for partners who share my vision for the future of maritime shipping in the digital age. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time on The Last Dinosaur.